Hello, AV Tweeps and AV Tweeps adjacent. Welcome to brAVe Space, or in this case, brAVe Skills. brAVe Skills is the practical offshoot of the brAVe Space podcast, where we explore topics that are most impactful to the world of business, corporate culture, and leadership. She's Britt.
I'm Britt.
And I'm Leon.
Now I say words. And like the title says, we want to focus on skills. We hope something in this episode is helpful to you, or by extension, someone you know.
Before we get started, we have a few disclaimers for you. The first is that opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and not necessarily representative of our partners or sponsors of the show. And the second is that we appreciate listeners' grace and understanding as we tackle subjects that we are possibly not experts in.
And now, on to the episode.
That was fun.
Weird.
Has anyone ever done? Oh, I think someone else is. Was it? I thought Ryan did. Ryan did the intro, I think, to your show once. So there you go.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll get used to it. You can start being a guest on the show.
That was my goal all along, is to just find ways where I could step back and make other people do this for me.
We have an episode coming up on delegation, I think.
Oh, yeah. All right, so for this episode, we are going to talk about boundaries. We're actually going to do 2 episodes about boundaries because it's such a lengthy topic and one where it just has a lot of facets to it. So for this episode, we're going to focus on setting boundaries when it comes to communication specifically, because sometimes we spend more time with the people who we work with than our own families, and it can become very easy for those lines to get blurry. So we're going to talk about how we can set boundaries within our communication with our colleagues. And Leon, let's talk about that a little bit on a, personal level, because there are a lot of variables. This is going to depend person by person. What are your communication boundaries?
So my communication boundaries stem from an understanding that I'm a very, I would say, personable person, or rather I'm a people person. And so I have imposed some boundaries to make sure that I never kind of cross a certain line. I have not as many boundaries kind of coming toward me. I just try to be a little bit more cautious going the other way. So, you can tell me anything you want. I don't really have a line for what I don't want you to tell me. But yeah, I think about trying to keep my communication based on whatever's important at hand primarily. So if there's a task we're doing, I try to keep as much of my communication focused on that as possible, knowing that I'll probably rabbit trail a little bit. Or in general, I try to, if I'm in a new situation, I try to kind of model the boundaries I may have based on what I'm seeing from the other person or what I'm seeing from the company, sort of what's the standard or what's the norm.
Mm-hmm.
What about
I
you?
like that. And I like that you said modeling too, because I think that's a really key part of this. For me, I set pretty hard boundaries to begin with. It's almost like being ice cream, where you start off really hard and frozen and you can melt over time if you're comfortable doing that as you get to know people. So that's kind of my style. And especially when I start off, I keep pretty strict, hard boundaries. And that's partly because there's so many different ways to communicate, right? So like, as most people know, I have a public facing X account. Anyone can follow me there. That's totally fine. But I also have a private Instagram account. You can't follow me there. Like that's just for friends, family, not for colleagues. If we're after hours, like there are people at work who have my personal cell phone number, but after hours, like text me a meme, text me a song you like, maybe don't text me about work right now, So just kind of like setting those boundaries and expectations of like, these are the ways in which you can communicate with me. These are the ways that you cannot. And to sort of the point you were making before, one of the strategies I use to make sure I don't get too derailed and I'll stay on topic with things is to have very purposeful agendas in advance, so people know this is what we can expect to sit down and talk about. And we usually, especially with the one-on-one, we start with the how are you, what's going on, whatever, but we know that at some point we need to move forward to these other tasks so we don't become chatty Cathys for too long or to go too far off the rails into weird places.
Yeah, actually, you're making me realize that I do have one more. I think it's been set for so long that I don't really do anything with it at this point. I don't think about it. But you mentioned the idea of social media. It's kind of the same for me. I have some practices that I just don't do on social media. I don't do a lot of tagging of people.
Mm,
Professionally, I will. So I have a LinkedIn, and that's more of the professional one that I use. That's different. I'm tagging people in a professional context. But yes, anything personal of mine. Or even if I blend something personal into the professional, I don't tag individuals in that.
mm.
Um, I there's something there's a guardedness that I have about that aspect of my life if I have not invited you into that. But it's been in place for so long that I think it's just natural now to do it. But that is certainly one, and I strongly recommend people consider doing that as well. Everyone's got their own line, but I would strongly recommend people consider the idea of having social accounts that are kind of separated for personal and professional. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
that was game changing for me for sure. And so one thing I'm curious about, because I heard you before say that, what did I hear? Now my train of thought went away. We're gonna have so many bloopers for this episode.
It's okay. It's my fault for starting the episode as as Brit. So now you're having what I would call just a Leon brain fart. It's my fault. It's not yours. I'll what I did say was that I mentioned like I'm a pretty comfortable person, so I
Mm.
make myself think, well, what's right for this person in terms of anything I communicate or the way that I will a little more than I think about what I need from you. Um, I feel like that's part of what I was saying. I'm trying to jog your memory.
Yes, so it's kind of a
Okay.
combination of those things actually, because you said that you're, a more comfortable person, but you also had used phrasing like hard lines or like
Mm.
as you're setting the like you have boundaries, you're setting them. So, especially as someone who can be a little bit more casual in your way of communicating with people, how do you make it a point to set those boundaries, especially when they're hard lines for you?
So I start by finding out what the other person expects and is comfortable with. I will say there's a few times when I have just found out that the person I'm speaking to is far more comfortable than I am, and I've had to say, okay, this is actually kind of safe here, what you're saying, but I'm curious if this is how you would talk to everyone. You should probably think about that for a moment. So I might kind of suggest things for them. But as far as hard lines for myself, I I try to allow people to bring whatever they feel they need to into a scenario. If it ends up being something that can be harmful, then we can have that conversation. But with me, you can toe that line a little bit before I'm probably going to push back on what you're sharing. However, there are, like I said, there are things that I'm guarded about that are just natural to do, so I don't really think as much about them. But there are things that I will say I don't approach topics that I know are hot button or very controversial topics right away.
Mm.
There's a level of comfort that needs to be there, and also a level of understanding what it is that you're okay speaking about before I will do that. Not because I want to dance around any hard subjects. I just realize that I can jar someone because it takes a lot to bother me. But I can jar someone with how comfortable I might be. So it's interesting for me thinking about the idea of these boundaries. Yeah. I hope I'm
Mhm.
responding to that question,
Yeah,
the way that you
yeah.
were hoping. Yeah, okay, okay. Hope I'm
I
giving
mean,
understanding.
there's no wrong answers because and that's the thing, it's so unique to each individual,
Mhm,
and so that's why I think it's so important. One of the takeaways, I'll repeat it later, is to sit down and identify what your boundaries are,
mhm,
and, like, what is a hard no for you. I think
mhm,
hard no's are some of the most important boundaries because it means you simply cannot cross them, and you have a plan for if they are crossed and they're in place purposefully. You know what like
mhm,
I think the purposefulness of it is really important. For me, there are some boundaries that I set explicitly because I feel like it's helpful to have that context and that explanation. So, for example, if I give my phone number to a colleague, I'll let them know,
Mm.
like, yeah, during the workday, feel free to text, call about X, Y, and Z. If it's after hours, like, I prefer not to be contacted unless it's an emergency. And once we hit the friendly level, I might be like, "You can send memes, my guy,"
Mhm,
whatever. Like,
mhm.
and
Yeah,
we
yeah.
start to build up a relationship that way. For me personally, I don't like to like hit the ground floor as like, "Here's my number, do what you will with it." you know.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So, I think, spoiler alert for the next episode where we're gonna continue talking about boundaries. Some of the ones you're mentioning are absolutely communication ones. The way that they relate for me is a little bit more about managing my time, which is what we're gonna
Mm,
talk about in our next episode. So I feel like it's strange that I came in. I wasn't meaning to sound like this, but it's like, "I don't really have any boundaries. I'm totally loose, just playing it just fast and open. It's totally cool. Do whatever you want." Um, Something you said made me realize, part of what is a little bit different for me, that I wonder if is different for others as well, which is that I do have a plan for when things go the wrong way.
mhm,
I I don't expect it necessarily to go that way. So sometimes there's a bit of sort of monitoring and learning a person, to kind of see where the line should be. There's some basic things that I keep in my mind because of being a manager and a leader, that uh, kind of fit under the umbrella of professionalism when it comes to communication boundaries. However, the plan kind of thing is something that I do have ready, to be able to address something that's been said in a scenario or the way that someone is communicating that does not really seem appropriate.
mm,
It doesn't mean it had to offend me. It just means that may not be appropriate. And I think I've recognized that maybe it's because I worked with a lot of people who are younger than me, or I have worked with a lot of people who are younger than me. Um, I've worked with a lot of folks who don't necessarily have a don't have a boundary either. But it's less of a comfort level thing and more of a lack of experience and understanding that there are some standards that you maybe need to learn, when you're sometimes fresh out of school in some cases, sometimes working with volunteers who may even be fresh out of like high school. Um, so a lot of this in my mind is being ready to coach when I see something possibly go the wrong way. But like you said, boundaries are so communication and all of these things are so broad and so wide. It can be difficult, I think, to know how to start that by saying, here are all the things we're just not going to do. Um, I think thinking about boundaries as a line you don't cross is one way of thinking of it. I think there's also the aspect of, well, what is it that you want to see though, too? Not
mm.
necessarily thinking about stopping the negative, but encouraging the positive. Um, that's someone said that to me. I don't know who it was, but I don't think I made that thought up.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, that's a solid thought, and one thing it makes me think of, and it helps me when I'm thinking about what I want out of a relationship with someone is to use the right language associated with that relationship. I
mm,
kind of have a pet peeve where we've morphed into this weird habit of calling everyone our friend.
mm,
Not everyone is our friend, right? And like if you refer to everyone you encounter as, "Oh yeah, my friend so and so," I think that becomes a lot more challenging for you to set those lines and understand what it is you need or want out of that dynamic. So, people at work, they're your colleagues, your coworkers, your boss, your direct report. Like there's lots of other words that you could be
yep,
using to help you frame this relationship and what you want out of it. And of course, you can be friendly. I'm not saying like, forget those people, they just exist at work. Like, no, of course. Like,
mhm,
of course, you should care about each other on a human level, have human conversations, and of course, be friendly, but at the end of the day, unless you've been working together a long time and you're recognizing that your relationship has grown to friendship, you're not friends.
Sure. Yeah. Also, the friend label, it's sort of like when people are dating and then someone says, I love you. And they're like, oh my gosh, I really hope the other person reciprocates. Um, Awkward if you're the first person using that and someone doesn't feel the same. It's maybe not really a it's not really a term that I think I would encourage people to use either. To be honest, sometimes with the caveat of something like, "Oh, that's my work friend," even though
Mm.
okay, now we're adding an adjective, and it's like, so what does that really mean? Um, but you mentioned this the concept of friendliness, and I know I just spoke about that a lot as well. There's a To me, there's a challenge of allowing yourself to get too friendly. I mentioned one of them, but I feel like one of the others that can be difficult to navigate for folks is when it's a real when you're actually friends with people, like real friends. I don't think that we struggle as much to tell each other when they're doing something wrong.
Mm.
But what's funny is then if people are just being really, really friendly with each other at work, then if work says you've got to address this issue, maybe you're their manager, or maybe you're you know at the same level in a hierarchy. It doesn't really matter. You have coworkers, and someone mentions, we kind of need to address this problem that this person has performance wise or whatever. They, I think a lot of times folks double back a little bit from
Mm.
doing that for some reason. It's a professional context. We're saying someone's our friend. Maybe we shouldn't, but you got so friendly that then you don't. I don't want to say bring the hammer down, but like you're not as direct and open and honest because you put a barrier up on by accident, I guess.
Right.
Um, I've seen this a lot, um, and it's weird because again, I feel like I'm comfortable with folks, but generally speaking, I don't know. My mom's from New Jersey. Maybe that's the thing. There's a northern part of me, but I see people sometimes struggling to be direct when they need to be. And I'm not sure if everyone recognizes that that ends up being the risk of getting too friendly sometimes,
Mhm.
or starting to say things like they're your friend. So at the end of the day, we judge performances, not people, and we have to be able to speak about those things, and we don't want things getting in the way of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that point, part of the challenge is the friendliness. I don't want to say it becomes a veneer. Like you could be genuinely friendly, but I think that it does become a barrier, like you said, because to give criticism then feels unfriendly.
Mhm.
And you start to worry, am I going to mess up this dynamic somehow, and we're going to revert, or our relationship's going to get worse in some way. To combat that feeling, I would offer the advice that I got from my leadership coach, which is clear is kind.
Mm. Yep.
So you are actually being kind to that person by giving them clear direction and clear expectation. And you can always couch that conversation in, I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't bring up XYZ problem to you.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of that. So I'm a huge believer that a problem that's not brought to light can't ever really be solved. So anything that can help get rid of that, I think, is 100% a good thing to do. I would like to ask a question
Mhm.
about um, how how might we approach making adjustments. So you start with whatever your communication style is, and then you probably adjust it. Hopefully you adjust it over time if you realize you need to. um, our company actually uses something called DISC.
Mhm.
It's one of those assessments that helps with that, and it mentions this concept of you will probably have an adapted communication style in different scenarios, and here's sort of where you might struggle with that. You have to do it, but you might struggle in some of these aspects. um, if that's what you're doing and you're moving toward a different way of communicating with a person or whatnot, what would you say are some tips for making those steps over time, making the steps toward the kind of communication that you feel like you need to set, or the boundaries?
I think it really depends on what they are and how significant of a shift it's going to feel to those around you or those who are impacted. So, if it's something subtle or something that you're slowly doing over time, I would just do it. Like personally, I would be like, just making this change. If they notice, I'm sure they'll notice eventually. If it feels like a hard change, I don't want them to feel like, yo, all of a sudden Brit is different. So at that point, I would give them like explicit information of like,
Mhm.
hey, I noticed that this thing isn't working for me, so I'm going to be making this change. And I might talk through that with them a little bit and get their feedback and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely do it though. Like, don't sit around being like, I wish things could be a little different.
Yeah. There's a buddy of mine, an actual buddy of mine. We ended up working together, but we were friends way before we worked together. So buddy first. But a buddy of mine years ago was very much a doer, and he was a very fantastic listener, and he would always communicate to you what he could do for you. Very seldom would he communicate why he might have a hard time accomplishing it. Um, so the boundary that wasn't set in his communication was the word no, was saying no when he needed to. Um, he would accomplish everything. He never missed anything, but that also meant it cost him something, probably a lot of time. Again, shout out to the next episode. Shout out, spoiler, I don't know. Shout out to an episode in the future. Oh gosh. Oh, I don't have enough. I don't have enough time to edit myself on this episode. Saying the stupidest things. Anyway, he struggled with that, and I remember when he had moved on to another job, and we were still talking, and he had mentioned that that was something that he realized way later, that was something he needed to build for himself, was a boundary of saying, I hear what you're saying, hold on for a second, before I go do that thing, I need to process that, and I may need to get back to you with why I can't do that. Like offering alternatives, you
Mhm.
know. And a lot of the listeners to this show, I believe, are in the tech industries and service industries, and I think that's something to realize is really powerful for us in terms of those boundaries. We have clients, and sometimes what we're being asked to do may not be something that we can do. There's nothing wrong with someone asking for you to do it, but I think there's a boundary here for your time and for also communication, where you start to let people get used to this concept of you may not say yes to everything because you just may have a limitation. Um, so for me, that's one of those steps, is start to say no, or start getting comfortable with no, so it's not so weird. It's not so hard to bring that out when you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really ties back to clear is kind, right? So if you let someone know, hey, I actually can't give you an answer right now. Give me X amount of time to get back to you. And then you come back and you say, no, I'm not able to do this because of insert reason here.
Mhm.
That clearness that you're giving them and that thought out answer is you being kind. It would actually be less kind if to yourself and to them if you take on work that you can't do and then it doesn't get done or doesn't get done to the quality that you would have liked.
Yeah, there's um, play that part back, everybody. Play that part back. That might be the mic drop for the episode. Is that clear is kind? Um, yeah. Uh, this is a concept that comes again. I sometimes think it's because I've got northern family members. I live in Virginia. Virginia is in the South. You may feel differently depending on where you're at. You may say we're technically not, but it's South enough. Um, Culturally, saying no, being not obstinate, but kind of rejecting an advance or rejecting a request is not as common as it would be in other places. And when I am being direct, I find that sometimes it can feel to someone as though I'm being blunt, blunt to the point of being overly direct. But I sometimes try to balance and struggle sometimes with the balance of trying to be direct in a way that is clear, but also still comes off as being kind in the right way. So I'm being firm without making someone who's not used to it think, "Oh gosh, did I just do something wrong? This guy's like straight up rejecting what I'm saying." So that bit about I need some time to think about something before I respond is actually something I've been taking to heart uh, uh, recently to put a pause. It doesn't feel as strong for somebody, but it gives me a second and kind of warms them up, I think, or softens them up to the no that's probably coming in a moment.
Right.
After I've
Yeah.
also thought through it and made sure that it is a no. Yeah.
Yeah, if you make them pause, they will realize, "Oh, there are 2 possible answers other than the
Yeah.
one that I was hoping for." So it becomes a little bit less unexpected for them that you might actually come back with a no. I like that. And, I hate to speak so generally about, like, men and women because there are so many variables to each individual, but I will say overall in American culture in the United States, little girls tend to be conditioned
Mm,
to not use words like no. And we tend to be conditioned to be a little bit softer, a little bit more willing to do things for others, and so I think that sometimes as you grow up and become a woman, it might be a little bit more challenging for you to set boundaries because you haven't really been taught that. Like you've been
mm.
taught to give service to others. That's a super general term. That's not the same for everybody. And, you know, you have women who weren't little girls, right? Like there's a whole, so it's just a lot of individual variables for humans, but just something to keep in mind. Sometimes I wonder if boundary setting was something I had to actively learn as an adult because I did grow up a little girl who was told, like, no, you just do for other people all the time.
That yeah, you're right. It can seem like an overgeneralization, but I mean, it's like it's the world we live in, right?
Mhm.
We can't ignore that. That's that may be a norm. Um, the the I just feel like there's so much power in the word no, though. Learning that at an earlier age, or let's just say earlier stage, because it could be an earlier stage in your career as well. Um, I do think that coming off of that concept, whether it's saying no, whether it's pausing on things, whether it's keeping certain aspects of your life out of certain communications if you don't feel like it's appropriate, all of these things, whatever it is that you're doing as a boundary, I think the best thing is that you're being consistent with it.
Yeah.
Once you start, it's being consistent. That's for you, but also helps reinforce whatever that boundary is in that scenario so that, again, there's a modeling aspect to this. I believe you're modeling it for the other person. You're also kind of modeling it for yourself because you hear yourself every time you say something and you're giving yourself an example. I know that sounds kind of weird, but if I say something, I hear myself say it, and then I'm more used to hearing it. And then I would say it again, and I'm more used to hearing it, which means I'm more used to this concept. Like I'm reinforcing all of this for myself as well. Um, so that might be another another tip for if you're starting to make adjustments in your communication boundaries, be consistent with them. Whatever it is that you're doing, just be consistent, be consistent. Um, and ultimately, if you're afraid that folks may not respect you because of your boundaries, I would argue that the opposite is true. That people, I think, do tend to have more respect easily for folks when they are consistent in anything, including their boundaries. You know.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I not to make this recording go longer than it should, but I really want to ask you because one thing I thought about throughout this was how sometimes saying no can feel dangerous to women. Um and I think that's less in a workspace context that we're focusing on, but more of a life context where, if I say no to this person, am I going to get a dangerous reaction?
Mm.
And I wonder how much of that fear we carry into other contexts. So while it might not, I certainly hope that it wouldn't be dangerous in any way to say no at work. There might be some underlying fear that you're carrying with you from other situations. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering if that thought hit your radar at all. Maybe not like, from a female perspective, but does the word no ever feel like genuinely scary to you?
Not really, but it's one that I think about a lot. Again, not trying to overgeneralize, but it's one of those things I've thought about the role of gender, the impact of gender on work scenarios a lot. I just choose to be aware of it. I'm not forced to. I choose to be aware. I can recall one of the first times I was hiring someone, and there was I had two front runners for a position, and one of them was female, and one of them was male. And I remember I had all these thoughts that came up as I was talking with HR about the concept of, wait, this person, because of what the role was going to be, there was going to be a lot of like one-on-one time we were probably going to be spending in places where it's like just going to be us. And I started thinking about it in terms of propriety, and I was like, okay, I don't want to not hire this person because I'm uncomfortable with the idea of it's me and a woman, and I'm, a happily married man. I don't want to be worried about the optics and then we don't get the job done, because we could still get the job done just fine. But I had that thought in my head. Where am I going with that as well? Is I also have had times where I have worked with women. I'm not overgeneralizing them all. I do not mean to, but I've seen more often a woman struggle with this idea of no. And sometimes if I know them in a personal level, I have seen what you just said, where parts of life, the impacts of aspects of life are um, bleeding into work, which isn't super weird because we did an episode where we talked about how work and life are integrated. Work is a
Mhm.
part of life; it's not separate. So it shouldn't be surprising to us. So I something I would probably say to any leader, any manager, any person who is working with people. So that's everyone, um, unless you're a mime, um, or a professional hermit or hobbit. If you work with people, do recognize that people's lives outside of work does come into work. It does impact things. Pretending that it does not, and just saying that it should never, it's not realistic. That would be assuming that people come to work and they become a different person when they come to work, and I don't think many people do. So it's not scary for me, but I've seen how scary it seems to people, and it's made me sad to then dig into it with them and find out sort of where that's coming from. Um, there are a lot of people in our industry who are women. There are a lot of people in our industry who are female. There are a lot of people in our industry, the AV industry that we work in. For anyone who's just found this podcast and has no idea who we are, um, there's a big A and a V in the title. And if you've been wondering why, because we never say it out loud, we never say why, but if you're wondering why, that's the reason.
Turns out we don't just really like those letters.
Yeah, we just brave. We're yelling. Oh man. Anyway, uh, there are a lot of folks who may be underrepresented, and when you're underrepresented, aren't when you're not in a majority, you're not given power and authority. You almost have to have it be given to you, or in some cases feel like you have to take it, and it's not a good place to be. I'm saying all that to say I know it's real, and we should recognize that it is real. And if you don't struggle with that yourself, probably find a way to empathize or sympathize with those that do, because it's there and it's around you every day, whether you realize it or people are bringing it to your attention or not. It is there every day, um, with someone probably in your midst. Not everyone, but someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for talking that through with me. So,
Mhm.
throughout this episode, we talked about our boundaries, methods that we used for setting them. We talked about a lot about saying no, which I think is just a super difficult boundary to set, which is why we ended up talking about it a lot. Um, what would you say our takeaways are for this episode?
Oh, you want me to give takeaways? No. Sorry, just decided to practice it. No.
Good job. Proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the ones that comes to mind for sure for me is the idea of setting, when you set a boundary, to communicate it clearly, to be in the practice of saying it, because others may not know what it is. So help them adjust as you're adjusting by letting them know what your boundaries are if you're making, especially if you're making changes.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say before even taking that step, the very first one is to identify your boundaries for yourself
Mhm.
because that might not actually be very clear. You might have some ideas of what you think they are. I personally find it super helpful just to write things down. Even if you do a free form, freestyle, word vomit onto page and then you can kind of pick out of there like turns out this is what's important to me and this is a boundary for me. Just getting going through that process of identifying for yourself is a really important first step.
Yeah, for sure. Um, with the idea of writing things down, having a practice, I think too, a pattern, a template for how you're going to communicate in different scenarios, your professional ones, different subsets of professional ones, personal, all of that. Make a routine for yourself so that you're not having to think on the fly on what are my boundaries and how am I approaching this when a new scenario presents itself. Would be the last takeaway on my side, I believe.
Yeah, awesome. And then one thing I would add is just to make sure that you're communicating as yourself, as you're setting boundaries, setting expectations, and managing those things as you go, because it's nice to get advice from people like us and, all of the people in your network, but we might phrase things in a certain way or say, this is how I do it. That might not actually be authentic to you. So I
Yeah.
definitely invite you to find your best method and your best language. Might want to run it by a few people, but you don't. I run stuff by people constantly, but you don't have to take stuff from us or anyone verbatim.
That's true. Like we said at the start of this episode, we may not necessarily be experts. So hopefully, what we're saying is helpful. But definitely talk to some trusted folks.
All right.
I
Do
almost rolled
you?
into the outro, and then I was like, "Wait a minute, no, not
I
my
feel
thing."
like you should. You did the intro.
Okay, I will. Then I will. Maybe I'll rewind back to what I just said because that would have segued nicely. Um, We hope that something that we've covered in this episode is helpful for you. Now, Britt and I, we're not the only experts in the world, and honestly, we're not necessarily experts in what we're talking about. So hopefully, there are folks that you know, that you trust, that you can relay ideas back and forth with if you happen to be struggling with this topic of setting communication boundaries. Have some trusted folks who can help sow into your development as a leader and as a person. And we hope to see you in the next one here on brAVe Skills. In the meantime, if you have any topics or questions that you'd like us to cover on this show, we do have a link in the description for a form where you can submit anonymously things that you'd like us to cover. And other than that, I think this is the end of the episode.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Oh my gosh, yes, please don't forget to do that. Like and subscribe. Do that a lot. Repeatedly. It's fine.
Now I say words.
If you want, or I could do the rest.
We shouldn't have flipped this. Now I'm confused. I guess I say your line.
Or I can do it. It's up to you. Before we get started, we have a few disclaimers for you. The first is that opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and not necessarily representative of our sponsors or representative or partners of the show. Oh shoot, maybe I don't know. I'll judge that. Start that again. This is a bad idea.
No, I love it.
But definitely take them to someone that's trusted as well. We have lots of different ways that we can move forward together, but if you've got a click, not a click, not a click, oh my gosh. Britt, maybe you should do it. I don't know what I'm saying. I feel like I'm just using the wrong words. Hey, if you got a click, use it. Forget everybody else. Clicks are good.
Books are great. That's where your friends are.
Yeah. God, Moses. This feels like I'm trying to end a voicemail, which I can't do, by the way. It's a thing.
Please call me back.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll try one last time.
Okay, you got this.
Like we said, there are things that we're discussing in these episodes where we're not necessarily the most expert people. That sounds stupid.
If only this was
we're here to give
recorded.
you advice. We're just here to give you advice. You can trust us. Definitely trust us. Anyway.
I trust people with glasses, don't you? It's like, well, ask him. He's got glasses. But if you're wearing your glasses like this, get away from him. Did you ever take directions from someone that looks like this? Where you gotta go? 44th Street. Well, why don't we take my spaceship? Yeah, I have to pick up Santa Claus anyway.